Welcome everyone to VIReC's Corporate Data Warehouse Cyber Seminar Series. Thank you to CIDR for providing technical and promotional support. Today's session is titled Data Management in SQL. Select Intermediate SQL Skills. This talk is aimed at an audience that has some basic familiarity with both SQL and the CDW and is interested in learning additional SQL commands for data management. Today's speaker is Dr. Margaret Gonsoulin. Dr. Gonsoulin is a sociologist who studied at the University of Virginia and taught for 8.5 years in the California State University system before she joined the VA Information Resource Center in 2014. Her work at the VA has primarily focused on the CDW. If you have any questions for Dr. Gonsoulin during the presentation, please send them in using the chat box, and I will present them to her at the end of the session. And now I am pleased to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Margaret Gonsoulin.
Thanks, Hera. Thanks, Molly. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. As you know, we'll be going through a few selected intermediate data management skills using structured query language. But before I begin, I'd like to give a great thanks and appreciation to Richard Pham, Mark Dean, Andy Kelly, and Hans Nielsen for all of their help, guidance, and mentorship. And also, I'd like to ask a question about the audience. So if you would be willing to participate, I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about your level of experience with CDW and how you would represent it on this scale from not having worked with it at all to very experienced.
Thank you. So as our attendees can see on your screen, we do have that first poll question open. The answer options are have not worked with it at all, have minimal experience working with it, have worked closely with it for less than 6 months, have worked closely with it for 6 months to 2 years, or you feel very experienced with CDW. And it looks like we've got a nice responsive audience. 3/4 of our attendees have already replied. I see a pretty clear trend, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll out and share those results. 14% have not worked with it. About 1/3 of our respondents have minimal experience, 20% less than 6 months, 25% 6 months to 2 years, and 7% feel very experienced with it. So thank you once again. And Margaret, I will give you back the screen share.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for participating in the poll. So for today's talk, I hope that you in the audience, especially the people who've been working with CDW for a little while, who answered this poll, will be able to walk away with a few new skills in your tool set. And these include just feeling better prepared to incorporate some best practices that we've been building throughout this cyber seminar series over the last couple of years. Also, to feel comfortable using temporary tables as you test out new logic in SQL so that you don't end up with a whole bunch of permanent tables out there taking up your workspace. Also, we're going to learn to recode columns using SQL, so hopefully that will become part of your repertoire if it isn't already. And that you will be able to use what are referred to as partitions to select desired records in those cases where multiple records are present in the data. So I'd like to begin the cyber seminar by going over 6 best practices, some of which we've covered before and some of which are new. In general, it's good when you're just wondering whether your query is doing what you want it to do, to begin by working with a small amount of data so that you don't overtax the system for simple problem-solving part of your process. So we'll review some best practices and how to do that. Also, we'll take a quick look at using partition dates and index columns where possible to make our queries run better. And this is a newly introduced element to the Cyber Seminar series, but it's pretty straightforward in how to find these dates and columns. And if you use them in your queries, things tend to go better. Also, we'll talk a bit about the best practice of converting your date-time fields that were introduced in the CDW Insights today and can help your queries run more smoothly and efficiently. And we'll talk about the temporary tables quickly in our best practices and more in depth later on in the cyber seminar. And of course, we'll review one more time, as we discussed in our previous cyber seminar last Monday, the use of execution plans to look at the estimated cost of your query and also look for potential signs of trouble with the query that you've written, so that you can learn to go and optimize your query better before you hit the execute button. And finally, as always, just a reminder that before you write any query, it's always really helpful to make sure that you are working with the data that you need and that you understand the data that you're working with by using the available documentation before you get started. So our first best practice, starting with that small amount of data, can be accomplished in numerous ways. Some of the ways we've already talked about, such as picking the top 10,000 rows or the top 100 rows or whatever number is relatively small, but that would still help you look at your data. And then by working with that small number of rows, you can see whether you have any large flaws in your logic or your query and fix them before you try to run it against the table as a whole or a larger cohort. Also, remember that you can reduce the amount of data you're working with by selecting only specific columns in your select statement rather than catching the whole of the table at one time. So just get your columns of interest only, and you'll start to save processing time. And also, as you'll remember, that you've seen many where statements along the way in this cyber seminar series, because that where statement allows you to reduce the data that you're requesting from the warehouse in a multitude of ways based on any column of interest. Some of the more common choices are only looking at a specific station or only looking at a specific date range, but it might also be only looking at a specific diagnosis or any number of other conditions. So let's move on to the best practice of looking at partition keys or indexed columns. We'll work at the partition key first. Partition key, in a kind of general overall way, can be understood as a key that takes a single large table and kind of splits it into smaller subtables with some little markers, if you will, in there. So it's like allowing you to look at a chunk of the table rather than going through every single row of the table. How do you figure out what are the partition keys in the CDW? Pardon me, I'm recovering from a cold. But there's a very straightforward way to look at these partition keys and identify which of them may be helpful given the data that you're working with at the moment. So a place to start is the CDW SharePoint site's metadata report. I put the URL here at the bottom of this slide. So on the left, you can see that I've expanded two domains, the health factor domain and the immunization domain, so that I could see the list of tables in the metadata report that are associated with these two domains. And if I focus my attention to the right-hand side, under the column called Relevant Dates, I can see the information I need about which keys in the tables, if they are present, would serve as partition keys for a query that I might write. So for the health factors domain, you can see that the fact table HF health factors has a partition key, health factor date time. And if I use that key in my query when I'm running against this health factors table, it will process more quickly and I could pick out a certain chunk of time, and it wouldn't have to go through the whole health factors table in order to find that chunk of time that I'm interested in. The same thing for the immunization fact table. Immunization has the partition key visit date time. And if I use that key, my query will run more efficiently. All right, let's take a look at that other kind of helpful column called an indexed column. An indexed column is a column that acts as a pointer to data in a table, much the same way that an index in the back of the book will point to a particular page, so you don't have to scan the whole book looking for information on your topic of interest. There's that page number there that'll point you right to the right page, then you can only scan that small section of the book. That's what an index column does for you in the corporate data warehouse. So how do you find the index columns for the tables that you're interested in using? Well, inside SQL Server Management Studio and inside the CDW work folders, as I've mentioned in previous cyber seminars, there are views that begin with the schema META or meta, and these are metadata views. So they're views that contain documentation about the data themselves, and it's stored right inside the database itself, as we've looked at several examples of this so far in the series. This is the new one, and it is called the meta.dw, that stands for Data Warehouse Index, and it's going to give us information about which columns are indexed. So here I just took a shortcut by right mouse clicking on meta.dw view index, and I have a little automatic query pop up in the query window that you can see here. Select top 1000, that's an automatic query. Then at the bottom of my automatic query, I added a where statement so that I would be able to focus in on particular schema, particular domain, or a particular table. You could choose whatever you want to focus on and say, only give me output related to this area of the warehouse. And then on the bottom right, you can see the automatic output and a column that tells you which of the columns in each of these tables will serve as an index. And if you use these, it'll point you to specific parts of the table and make your query run more efficiently. Our third best practice comes to us from Andy Kelly's talk on the CDW Insights Day, which was given on July 27, 2016. The URL for all the Insights talks are here at the bottom of this slide. And he tells us how to convert our date-time functions in CDW to make them process more efficiently. So in this example, you're looking at the language that Andy Kelly said to use with the example of visit date time, but you could put in any date time that you happen to be using in the warehouse and write out this same language, and it'll help your query run more smoothly. Our fourth best practice for review today is using temporary tables until you're sure you're ready to make a permanent table. And we'll talk about this in more detail later on in the cyber seminar.